Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to UCD and welcome to this project event, the Hybrid-e project. We are delighted to have you all here today. I'm just going to go through a few little housekeeping pieces for you before we begin. So I'm David Jennings. My colleague Owen McAvoy is the other kind of key project person here in UCD. So just to say, we're going to record James's lecture. So if you do ask a question of James later on, you'll know that you might be recorded. We can edit that out if need be, but the lecture will be recorded. Thank you very much. In terms of the parallel session a little later where people are going to split rooms, so our other rooms are just upstairs. So out there upstairs and kind of behind me. If you sent your presentation, perfect. I will make sure your chairperson has it momentarily. If you haven't done so, please do so. And I'll make sure the chairperson has it momentarily. Other than that, just to say to you all again, we have a reception this evening in the Museum of Modern Literature on Stephen's Green. You are all very welcome to attend. I know it's a little bit of a journey to get in there, but we have the museum to ourselves this evening. So there is wine, drink, chat, a few exhibitions of the project work, but also we'll be delighted to see as many people there as you can. So other than that, I'm going to hand over to Marie Clarke, Professor Marie Clarke, who's going to do our formal introduction for our speakers. Thank you very much. Thanks, Marie.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning and to welcome you all to this Erasmus-funded project Hybrid-e. And I want to extend a very warm UCD welcome to our project partners from University of Amsterdam, Aristotle University and Cainteoirí. And I know that you will have a very productive time here with us. And I know that you'll have a lovely time considering you're being hosted by David and Owen. So I hope that you enjoy all of what is on offer here in UCD. This is a very important project, and in the context of hybrid teaching models, digital technology for online and the blended components. And I suppose these are important issues in the context of teaching and learning, student experience, and informing the research literature. When coming out of COVID and reflecting upon it, and I was just talking to Naomi there earlier about what a terrible experience it was, the fast adjustment in trying to transition into a brand new space and trying to deal with that. And a woman of my years has developed a number of teaching practices that have stayed with me for a very long time, and that challenged every one of those, and rightly so. It was quite a shock. I had to go back and rethink as to what exactly I was doing and supposed to be doing with my students, and that was one that was humbling in relation to understanding what was going on, and with a lot of help from education technologists, and particularly Liam Fogarty in our own school, try and get me on track in relation to this. I began to realize that it was not just the content and material that I had to rethink, but I had all of this housekeeping stuff to manage, clicking this button, clicking that button, moving here, moving there. And if I hadn't built all of this into the teaching just wouldn't work, okay, aside from what the learning experience was for the students. And when you think back and you try and reflect upon what is actually happening, you consider the emotional toll that it takes on your actual teaching practice and being a teacher in that kind of setting. And they were all, I'm really glad that James is going to look at this type of thing in his talk, because it's something that doesn't feature prominently in the literature. And it's wonderful that this project is unearthing these kind of things to try and make us realize about the human dimension and what it actually means. Currently, I'm doing an online course with 12 students. 6 of them are from Pakistan and 6 of them are from India, 3 from New Delhi and 3 from Chennai in India, and then the other 6 are in Pakistan. Liam again helped me put all the material together in terms of doing that, and it looks very sophisticated. I could interview for Sky based on his how good he makes me look. But in reality, when you're in the classroom, I meet them once a week then, on Zoom to go through the material and have any issues and problems and that sort of thing. But what's very disconcerting is in New Delhi, they're used to noise all the time. So when they're speaking, you have all the cars zooming up and down all of the time. In the rural areas in Pakistan, suddenly they're talking and their connection just goes on you in relation to it. And then it's bringing them back in, trying to help them to catch up. And then you're completely left disorientated yourself as to where it goes. So this stuff isn't easy. And it isn't easy no matter how well you plan for it. And these are the kind of things that we have to look at seriously when we consider what does hybrid mean and what does online mean in terms of the supports that are there. I want to thank David and Owen very much for their leadership on behalf of UCD in this project. They're doing this work in addition to everything else that they have to do, and their dedication is reflected in the wonderful programme that has been scheduled today. Their work and their collaboration also demonstrates the vibrancy of the relationship between teaching and learning and our education technologists, all of whom have worked very hard and have made an outstanding and do make an outstanding contribution to enhancing our faculty teaching and our students' experience of learning. And this is also reflected in the richness of the case studies that are listed for this afternoon as well. I'd also like to welcome Associate Professor Eamon Costello, who joins us from DCU, leading the workshop on tEL Community of Practice, Framework and Vision. And that's a really, really important element of our work here in UCD as well. And our education technologists through our ETAN network make a huge contribution right across the teaching and learning experience. And sometimes find it hard to develop a real community of practice because they're so busy and there's so few of them in across the university, and to have the opportunity to think and consider that is very important. I want to thank everybody who has agreed to serve on the plenary panel, members from across all areas of UCD, and our Students' Union President, Martin Ariada. Thank you for giving your time to be here, all of you, and your insights and your experiences will not just, I suppose, provide important data for the Hybrid-e project, but will also serve to enhance our own work here as well. And now to introduce our guest speaker. Okay, so Dr. James Lamb is from University of Edinburgh Centre for Research in Digital Education and Edinburgh Futures Institute. His research explores the relationship between learning spaces and digital technologies, and he's the co-author of the Manifesto for Teaching Online, and has also written about multimodal assessment, mobile learning, and sonic methods within education research. And we have many relationships with Edinburgh, James, as I was saying to you earlier, in terms of colleagues that we know. The Teaching and Learning Unit here works closely with your colleagues in Edinburgh. We've relationships through Universitas 21 and more recently through the Una Europa Alliance. So thank you very much for being with us here today. The title of your talk, Choreography and Improvisation in Hybrid Higher Education, highlights the spatial and temporal complexities of this process and the implications for the act of teaching. And I'm looking forward, as everybody else is, to it very much. So thank you very much, James. Okay.
Much.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. I'm really delighted to be here working with you today. I don't think I've ever replied so quickly to a conference invitation as I did to this one, because the nature of the eHybrid project and this event today so closely ties in with my own interests and my own teaching around learning spaces and digital education. So I'm really glad to be here today. I want to thank David and Owen for their invitation and also for supporting my plans to travel here sustainably as much as possible. When I travel to conferences, I'm trying to avoid flying to events. It isn't always possible, but when that opportunity arises, I'm trying to avoid using airplanes and their harmful ecological impact, although I was somewhat regretting this decision as Storm Betty was throwing our ferry about at 10 o'clock in the Irish Sea on Saturday night. But nevertheless, thank you for your support in enabling me to do this. So what I want to do today is talk about hybrid higher education, or I sometimes will refer to it in this talk as fusion education. So within my work at Edinburgh University, for reasons I'll come on to explain, we refer to it as fusion, but I'll use it interchangeably. And what I want to do is put across 3 propositions, which is C here. The first of these is that we can think about hybrid or fusion as a kind of choreography. And this choreography concerns trying to think productively about the ways that we can bring together spatial, digital, pedagogical elements together. And so it represents a kind of choreography. And this idea of choreography, it's something I'm working on at the moment with some colleagues, Tim Fawns, Joe Noteboom, and Jen Ross, who will work within the digital education field. And it's something that we're writing about at the moment. So I'm going to be kind of testing out some of those ideas today. The second proposition I'm going to put forward is that the performance of hybrid education puts extra emphasis on the educator's ability to improvise. There's extra complexity, as we've already been hearing, involved in hybrid or fusion education. So that, I think, requires improvisation and agility to respond to these different kinds of elements that are at play. Education is always messy. Things can go wrong in any educational context. I've been locked out of physical classrooms. I've been locked out of digital classrooms. I've had people invade physical classrooms. I've had people invade digital classrooms. Things can go wrong. When we're bringing these different elements together of online and physical space, we add to that complexity. So I think there's extra need for improvisation. And the third point I want to make is really important, and that is that I think successful hybrid or fusion education emerges from seeking out different voices, different stakeholders. And I've already commented to David last week when I was looking at the contributors to this event and to our panel session later on. It's really good to see the representation of academic developers, lecturers, people with research interests, student union, a whole range of different voices feeding into that process. So that's going to be the third point I make. What I'm not going to attempt to do is to say that this is best practice or this is a how-to guide. I think education is very much contingent on context. Therefore, I won't be saying, and this is how you should do it. And in fact, I'm going to talk about things that I think have worked, but I'm also going to reflect on experiences where things haven't quite gone to plan, because I think that actually can be often more productive than just saying, and these are your 10 points to realize successful teaching in a hybrid context. I'm going to be drawing on some of my teaching experiences, some of my development work within the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which I'll come on to introduce, and also some of my research as well. Now, I've got lots to cover, so if I don't end up having time to take questions at the very end, I'll be really glad to take them during the break or across the duration of the session. So thank you everyone for joining me for the session today. Now, this is going to be mostly a talk about practice, things that work, things that don't work, describing different processes. It's not going to be an overtly theoretical talk, but I will draw on examples of research literature, which you can follow up as you wish. But I do want to touch on some of the conceptual work that informs what I'm going to talk about and informs my thinking. And that relates to the idea of the post-digital university, as I'm calling it here. And I find this to be a really useful set of assumptions when we're thinking about fusion education, hybrid education, online education, digitally mediated education. And so I'm going to run through what I find to be some of its most productive ideas. And the first one is that digital technologies are woven into our surroundings. So looking around me here, a bank of laptops, lots of smartphones, data projector. These have become the matter-of-fact kind of technology. So technologies are now woven into our surroundings, and they're woven into our educational surroundings. The second point, which I've captured on the slide here, is that I think that rather than necessarily being enthralled to technology as we might once have been, technologies have kind of become a bit more matter-of-fact. And this is contrary to the claims of some of the educational edtech companies, that often talk about this technology is going to profoundly transform what you do in the classroom? Well, it probably won't do that, but it will have some kind of impact. And I have a folder on my laptop, and I keep screenshots of every time I see a virtual reality headset being used to represent the future of education. And it's usually, an attractive student smiling, looking up in awe at the possibilities. And if only we just give everyone headsets, education will be completely different. And so I was really happy to walk around campus this morning. So I got here early and I saw a really nice billboard of a student looking up with a virtual reality headset. Now, virtual reality has a place in education. I use virtual reality in my own work, and I'm interested to attend the workshop today by Jackie Wang, who's going to be talking about some of that. But it probably isn't going to completely change what we do. And I think that's an important part of what post-digital thinking is about. So emergent technologies, they merge together with pre-existing approaches and pre-existing practices. We can often talk about there having been a digital revolution, but a revolution implies that something new has come in and entirely swept away what's gone before. And again, that's not the reality, I don't think. Technologies do change how we work, but they more often blend together with our different approaches. And I think we see that in hybrid. We're still using many of the same pedagogical approaches, but perhaps they've adapted to a new kind of environment. And the final point is that it's never just about the digital. It's never just about technology. Technology is always bound together with other issues: health, cost, procurement processes, university strategy, funding, all sorts of different factors. So it's never just about the learning. It's never just about the tech. It's always a combination of different elements. And I've seen that in some of my own research. So I did an ethnographic study of the learning spaces of students in history in my university. And I spent a year learning a great deal about American history. And from my view at the back of the class, I would take photographs. And I think this is really useful in trying to capture some of these points I've made about fusion education. So it's clear here from that first proposition I talked about that technologies have become an everyday part of our educational surroundings. So it's like, NASA mission control or Rio de Janeiro smart cities with all the kind of laptops there. But that doesn't mean that we've abandoned all the things we used to do before. So Lizzie, the student in the front here, taking notes in a much more analog way, but alongside that, she's got her smartphone as well. But it's never just about the technology. It's about light. It's about layout. It's about thirst. It's about the human factors as well. So I think this is quite a nice way of kind of capturing what I'm talking about in terms of the post-digital. And we often hear of the ways that technologies are going to change our behaviors. And I suppose examples of this would be robots will replace teachers. Video conferencing means we don't need physical campuses anymore. ChatGPT has broken assessment. And these are some of the claims that we get. So they're quite deterministic. It's this, that we are almost powerless to respond or reject the imposition of technologies and what they're going to do to us. But there's another stance, which is that technologies are just tools. And if only we would introduce this tool into our teaching, we would satisfy our learning outcomes, or assessment would improve if we only introduce this platform. And of course, it's much more complex. It's more nuanced than that. However, we do at some point have to take a position on what we think technology is to be. And so in the talk I'm delivering here, and this is how I tend to generally refer to technologies, or I'll also call them digital resources. It's the hardware, the software, the Wi-Fi, the data infrastructures. I'm also going to talk quite a lot about learning space. I'll use the phrase learning space quite a lot. And space and learning space is something which has been heavily theorized. Is it about a place? Is it about practices? Is it about processes? Is it about people? Or is it a combination of these things? From my point of view, a learning space, well, learning has to happen somewhere. Even if it's online, it has a physical situation somewhere. So for the purpose of today's talk, a learning space is any setting where educational activity is performed. And I take a really broad view of what educational activity is. It's writing and reading lectures, but it's also sketching, presenting, just thinking through ideas. And this is really pertinent to fusion education because with advances in digital technologies, thank you very much, and the growth in online education, we're no longer bound or so closely bound to the physical classroom and campus as we once were. And just to give you an example, thank you, Anna. I'm working on a book project at the moment with Lucilla Carvalho, who works in learning design and learning spaces at Massey University in New Zealand. And the title of our book, the aim of our book, is we're trying to explore what makes for convivial, equitable, sustainable learning spaces. And we're particularly interested in learning spaces outside of classrooms and campuses. And within one of the chapters, what we have is an experiment, a short experiment where all the different authors in this book, as they've been writing, we've asked them to document one of their writing spaces and to tell us what they were doing and when they were doing it. And this is just an example of some of the writing places. So these are learning spaces. And I think this is quite interesting, again, from a hybrid perspective, because we don't necessarily always know very much about those settings beyond the campus where learning has taken place. Walking around the campus this morning, these grand buildings of steel and glass, and my own university is the same. Universities spend massive amounts of money in buildings and in really nice learning, physical learning environments. But at the same time, we recognize that so much more learning, so much more student work, but also teaching and staff work takes place beyond the campus, and we don't know so much about those settings. So I think it's really useful to think about what do we know about those spaces where learning is taking place. And in this example here, we can see how a learning space could be, it could be a fairly conventional space, an academic office. It could be somewhere a bit more impromptu, like the park. It could be the home office space, but space can also be transitory. So this is Eurostar, and I was waiting to get a train back from a conference and I had half an hour to kill. So we get these kind of impromptu, kind of almost transitory learning spaces. We get the home office, but we also get more social spaces. And I think it's really interesting to think about if we accept that our surroundings shape our educational activities, whether that's writing or thinking or teaching, if we accept that those surroundings shape our environments, what is the influence of staff or students working in these different kinds of settings as opposed to working in the lecture room or the library or the laboratory? And from a staff point of view, I think it's quite interesting. If I mark an essay with a nice coffee in a sophisticated cafe, I think that was in Uppsala in Sweden, which I'm not likely to be any marking in, unfortunately. But if I was doing some marking in that cafe, I'm probably going to be in an especially good frame of mind. So it's just interesting how our surroundings shape our thinking and our practice. So what influence does the different environment kind of have upon us? And so to move on and talk about hybrid specifically, I think the first thing that's worth pointing out is that it says, well, it has different titles. So I've mentioned that I'm interchangeably using Fusion, which is what my own university or my part of the university uses, but in other parts of the university, it's hybrid. But it's also called HyFlex, dual mode, bimodal. And within that, it also serves a number of different interpretations. I suppose that for me, for hybrids to have meaning, we need to think of it as something more than just a way of grouping together all learning that involves digital And I think to an extent, this is what's happening, is that all sorts of education involving tech, well, that's hybrid, isn't it? To the point that, how do we distinguish hybrid then from almost any other education? I actually think now that you'd have to work pretty hard to find degree programs that don't involve digital technologies. Even if we go into those educational parts of the campus where students are not using digital technologies in the moment, there's a good chance that their thinking and the prior learning has been shaped by digital technologies, by web-based resources, through online learning management systems. So for me, hybrid or fusion has to be something more than just learning with tech. And the definition I've put at the bottom is the one that I've been putting together with my colleagues, Tim Thorns, Joe Noteboom, and Jen Ross. And it's a way of thinking about educational approaches that don't privilege being either online or on campus. And I think this is a really important point, is that I think for hybrid to really work, we need to recognize it not just a case of being where we shift classroom teaching and spread it online. It's about a fusion first position, which I'm going to come on talk about a little bit later on, but it's not about making an online version or just putting some tech into a course. It's about thinking, okay, well, what are the potentialities of students being in two different locations, online and on site, and being together synchronously, but also potentially asynchronously as well. What can we do that we can't achieve either through online education alone or through being assembled together synchronously in the physical space like we are today? So I think there are potentialities. My goodness, there are also challenges, and I'll talk about some of those as well. But I think that's a really useful way to think about it. And I think Norgard makes a good point that hybrid isn't just about a set of processes. It is this it's a way of thinking. It represents an interesting opportunity, which I think is captured in your eHybrid project. It's a way of doing something more. You know, hybrid, it's become synonymous with the reaction to the challenges of COVID and lockdown, but it's been around much longer. So it's been around 20 years or more. People have been talking about hybrid, and that applies to the work that I'm involved in at Edinburgh University, albeit it doesn't go back quite as far as that. And I want to talk about then an example of fusion education. It's an ongoing example. It's within part of the University of Edinburgh I work within. It's called the Edinburgh Futures Institute. Now, the first thing I should say is this is not an official university photograph. If that was the case, the university photographers wouldn't have captured bags of cement and breeze blocks. So the campus is not quite finished, but we don't open our doors until I think another couple of weeks. So I took this on Friday by having to stand up and lean over a fence. But this is our Edinburgh Futures Institute, and I think it provides us with an interesting example to think through fusion. So just to give you a bit of context, so this is a former Victorian hospital. It's right in the very heart of Edinburgh. So if anyone is familiar with University of Edinburgh and its central campus, this is right next door to it. And the university acquired this site at a discount because the developers had bought a much larger space and the hospital was in a fairly poor state of repair. It was going to be expensive to convert, so the university was able to get a discount and bought the space with the idea of having a interdisciplinary quarter within the centre of the city and close to the university. And at that point, there wasn't a specific plan to develop it as a fusion space. However, that emerged later on. And it was decided that within this space, we would have a new portfolio of programs dedicated to fusion education. And what that meant is we had a chance to do something new with the way we thought about teaching and learning, because it was physically a new part of the university, but also we had a bit more freedom to think differently because we're drawing from across different parts of the university to develop our programs. So to give you a little background, so since 2016, we've been developing a portfolio of interdisciplinary programs, almost entirely at postgraduate level, and they're all concerned with futures. And I'm program director for, or co-program director for the MSc in Education Futures, which I'll come on to talk about. And all of these courses are available in what we call fusion mode. And so a student, when they apply to join the Education Futures, the MSc in Education Futures, they apply either to be an on-site student or they can choose to be an online student. Now, those are kind of problematic terms, as I'm going to come on and discuss, but those are the two modes of engagement. Now, students can study full-time or they can study over a series of different years. But the key thing is those students, the on-site students and the online students, are one single cohort. They are one group. And that's the approach that we have across our programs. Most of our courses are 5 week long, so they're 10 credit, 5 week courses. And they have a mixture of online study, quite a lot of online asynchronous study, but at the heart of all the courses, we have a 2-day intensive, called a 2-day intensive, which takes place within a physical setting, not so different from this, but also simultaneously also online. We've been developing these programs since 2016. I've only been a part of this since 2020, when I took up my role as a lecturer within the university. And very soon after joining the university, of course, we were affected by COVID. And so that caused disruption to the plans on what we've wanted to do, which is why the building isn't quite finished yet. But what it also did was the experiences of COVID also presented a learning opportunity for us. COVID was also one of the reasons why we refer to our work as fusion rather than hybrid, because we felt that hybrid has become synonymous with almost like an imposed response to the challenges of lockdown. And we wanted to reflect the fact that ours has been a more measured response, or a measured way of developing education and thinking differently about pedagogy that's been entrained for a number of years beforehand. So we've gone for fusion, which isn't to say that ours is the only example of that being the case. And I've pointed towards a paper by Annalise Reyes, where she talks about a comparable example in Leuven. So one of the nice things about being a part of this project has been I've been able to contribute to the way we develop our learning spaces, how they connect with technologies, how we develop our educational programs. So bringing together this kind of choreographing of space, because we have not quite a blank shell, but we have a new building to work with. So whereas hybrid has often been a case of how do we adapt existing classrooms to support hybrid so that students can attend online, from the start we said, what does a fusion space need to look like? So that's been a real opportunity there. And then we've also been able to think not about how do we change our existing program to make it fusion or hybrid. It's like, okay, starting from a fusion first position, what could this program be? That isn't to say, though, that hasn't been constraints. We don't have the power to remove supporting walls. We can't change the windows. We can't lower the ceilings. It's a listed building. But then there are also other constraints: cost, procurement processes, time, all sorts of different factors influence what ultimately comes to be realized within the classroom. And the point I put at the bottom is something I found really interesting. I teach on 2 different programs within the university. So one within this EFI and one also within our School of Education. And I think, like lots of colleagues who are involved in our EFI project, there's been quite a nice feeling of almost like liberty, that because we're doing something new, we don't have to confront, yeah, but that's not how we do things. Or no, assessment has to be done this way because it's always been done this way. Or, well, these are the processes, so we just have to follow that line. Yes, there are still compliance issues, of course, and there's rigor, but we get to think newly about what assessment and teaching can look like. So that's been a really exciting opportunity. I mentioned in one of my earlier slides that I think fusion education benefits from bringing together different voices. And I've put a couple of references here in the first bullet point. One's from Peter Goodyear, who's done lots of really important work around learning design and around learning spaces. And he's made the point that education researchers who have an interest in university learning spaces have often been quite content to, I'll paraphrase a little bit, but sit on the margins and critique, and rather than necessarily offering something productive. And I'm possibly guilty of that myself. And what we really need for the design of learning spaces and learning practices, we do need practical approaches as well, rather than just from a distance saying, well, you shouldn't have done it that way. And Joss Boys, who's based in University College London and a really key voice in learning spaces, also made the point that sometimes learning spaces could be held back because architects, estate staff, academics, technologists, we all have our different interests. We speak different languages. And it isn't always easy to bring together these different kinds of voices. And not that I had anything to do with it, but within the EFI project, it is something that has been taking place. So I've been involved in groups that have been made up of AV specialists with student representation involved, architects, state staff, senior managers, all feeding in our own different ideas around what fusion or hybrid can be. And a part of that involved staging a workshop, which I'm going to talk about. And in May 2021, along with one of my colleagues of the time, Martin Hawksey, we staged a workshop which brought together experts and voices from different areas to come together and speculatively consider what fusion or hybrid education could look like. And using 4 different spaces that we were going to be developing within our new building, which was a lecture space, a flexible teaching room, an ideation studio, but also the cafe and the social areas, because learning happens there too. We got everyone to think about 4 different questions, which I've listed here, which is how can we enable fully online students to feel actively present within the physical classroom? How can we support interaction and collaboration between students in different physical settings? What do we need to do to assist teachers as they're trying to teach across modalities? And also, what can we do to generate intimacy and emotional engagement? So seeing learning not just as a transaction around knowledge, but giving people a sense of whether it's connection or belonging or feeling a part of something significant. And we did this using architectural drawings and suggestive technologies, but really it was about ideas. And what we came up with, we recorded the conversations, and then soon after, Martin Hawksey and I worked through the recordings and distilled them down into, I think it was 19, or what did my notes say? 17 what we call philosophical propositions, which were kind of these bigger ideas about what do we mean by fusion or hybrid, and then tied around our 4 different learning spaces, 32 different practical approaches. And we wrote these up into reports, and I've got a link to the report so you can access that. It's on my website, so feel free to have a look at that. But I'm just including a few of them here just to give you a kind of feel for what we were thinking of. And so we have propositions which are concerned with the way that we configure a physical classroom, but also an online classroom enacts particular power assumptions and power dynamics within the classroom. And if we were to say that the current interest, the recent interest in kind of more constructivist, social constructivist learning, which lessens power hierarchies between staff and student, if that's something we want to work with, how do we try and achieve that within fusion spaces? A really important point was that whilst administratively we refer to students as being on-campus students or online students, it's not necessarily a distinction which really always holds true. I touched on this when I was talking about post-digital thinking before, but a student in the physical classroom is very often also an online student. And that's something we've seen borne out in practice as students switch between modes. And we need to try and avoid the temptation, I don't always successfully do this, of defining a student as either being an onliner or an on-site student, because it's not necessarily always a helpful distinction. And we also came up with ideas around privacy and surveillance and how we can try and establish community across different synchronicities and different modes of engagement. So those were some of the philosophical propositions, and I'll return to one or two of those later on if I have time. And we also generated practical propositions as well. And these were ways of just helping us to think about how we might design teaching, but also the configuration of technologies, the building of those learning spaces themselves. So the different stakeholders, if you like, the different people involved in this workshop and this thinking can then go away and use it to inform their thinking. And we were thinking things about here, like really practical things. Where do I stand? What does eye contact mean when I've got an audience here and an audience there? These kinds of things. I'm interested in things like, what does it mean for an online student to arrive in class? I think so much of the language we use privileges being on site. We talk about our students arriving for class. We talk about students being present, meaning you people, not people watching. And how does that the online student, if you're talking about the in-class and then you're saying, but also our online students as well. When we were trying to achieve equity of experience within our fusion programs, it was really important that we didn't give the impression that this was essentially kind of campus-based programs delivered digitally. It had to be fusion first. And the phrase we used was equity of experience. That doesn't mean that the students can have or do exactly the same things. It isn't always possible. We have maker spaces where students are working with, or will be working with textiles and lots of physical objects. We can't always send kits out to students in different parts of the world for them to do the same. So we have to think about different ways of providing an equally high quality experience. So the phrase we used was equity of experience. So what I've talked about so far is the kind of choreographing. How do we try and plan and structure in a very fusion-based way? But it also involved rehearsal. And so I've included this picture here. And this was in one of our fusion studios. To begin with, and as I've mentioned, our full building wasn't available. So we adapted existing teaching spaces to create fusion studios. And this is one of them. So that's my colleague, Martin Hawksey, who was the learning technologies lead on the project. My colleague, Tim Thorns and Jen Ross. And in the background, we have Stephen Dishon, who is involved in our learning media technologies and learning spaces. And so we came in to rehearse. And this is something I have done in physical spaces teaching, but more often than not, I would just arrive a little early, make sure the slides work, and that's fine. I think when we are engaging with two different audiences and these extra layers of complexity, I felt the need to go in and rehearse exactly where am I going to stand, where are the camera views going to be, where am I best going to be heard. So there was, yes, there's choreographing, but for me, I also found it helpful to have not quite a full dress rehearsal, but a kind of practice run of how it would look. So we get choreography, we get rehearsal, and just to point towards some of the complexity involved, I asked some of my learning technologies colleagues to list the different AV and the different technologies that are in a fusion studio. So I'm not going to run through all these, not least because I don't really know what all of them mean, but I know what they helped me to do in terms of teaching. But this does point towards the complexity of trying to simultaneously work with different audiences and the kind of choreography, the kind of planning that goes in from the technical side of things. And to make that point again, this is so much a venture involving different groups and different experts within the university. So whereas previously when I was doing solely on campus teaching some years ago in the university, I was pretty self-sufficient. Admittedly, I was using an overhead projector, so that was reasonably straightforward. And then we moved into to PowerPoint and data projector. But now I am much more dependent on the expertise and the input of my colleagues in learning technologies. And this is what the kind of the outcome was. So just if we look at this. Okay, so this is kind of teaching and practice. This is a Fusion studio. And I'll just draw attention to a few different things. So we have Evan, who's in China, Michelle was in Chile, and Ryan was also in China. So they are 3 members of the online group. There's another set of students you can't see here. This was had previously been a medical teaching room. So I was in the gallery area looking down onto the students. And a few things I think are interesting that come out across the screen. One of them, and you see Michelle doing this, is she's using hand gesture. At one point, Evan uses thumbs up, and it reminds me that even for all the technologies, it's still quite a multimodal experience. Yes, you can't see the entirety of the online student, but facial gesture and posture can still be useful. But Evan, you did the thumbs up sign, and that's maybe suggestive of the fact that he felt that was the easiest way of being understood. And one of the challenges that we've encountered has been around sound. And when you've got lots of dialogue happening, it can be quite a challenge, and it involves moving around the room and tweaking things. Ryan here's smiling, which points towards the conviviality of the space. This was we've run this course twice, had a pilot course and then the actual course, and the feedback has been good. Students have enjoyed it. Something I've enjoyed about being in the Fusion space as someone who most recently has been doing online education. When I do an online session, I can never actually really tell if people are getting it or if they're enjoying it. And I think in the physical space, it's easier to determine that. So the experience has been a good one. It's not just about Fusion, it's to do with all sorts of different things. However, if the Fusion arrangement had been working against it, then I think we'd have been very clear to see that Fusion wasn't working for us. But it also involves levels of improvisation as well. And a really important part of our work in Fusion, bearing in mind this complexity, is that when we do these 2-day intensives, we employ a teaching assistant. So that's a PhD student. And can't say how valuable that has been, because having a teaching assistant in the room for me means that when students are arriving into the physical space and I can be looking at them, the teaching assistant is also welcoming our online students. The teaching assistant, I work with Joe Noteboom. What he does is he actually is seated in the physical space, but he is there as an online student. So he's following in Teams, he's got his headphones on. And that's really important for me, because if there's a problem from some of the online group that I don't see, he's able to deal with those. And also, I think he put this in his reflection. When I walk out of shot or I forget to use the microphone and I become inaudible or off screen for the online student, he tells me, and I think that's really important. Everyone's probably been in diffusion sessions, meetings where colleagues just start having a conversation amongst themselves and you're sitting there with your hand raised in Teams and you feel invisible and you feel ignored, and then you eventually feel angry. So Joe is able to call me out every time I walk out of shot. But also what he did was, because we use different cameras, he was able to do a more kind of improvisational role, which is almost like a stage direction or film direction, changing the cameras so that the student could actually follow. The online students could really feel a part of what was happening. Okay, so improvisation there from the teaching assistant. A different kind of improvisation, which I'll talk about here, and these are examples from the article that I'm writing with my colleagues Jen Ross, Tim Fawns and Joe Noteboom around choreography in hybrid space. And Jen refers here to something quite different. And when she came to teach her course, there'd been a spike in COVID. A lot of students were ill. There was a lot of anxiety. And this is where we really saw the flexibility of Fusion education. So students who would otherwise, students who didn't feel safe coming into the university campus or whose health didn't enable them to, they were still able to attend fully because they had that fusion option. So those students, although they were registered on-site students, they had the online experience instead. In actual fact, across the 2 days of Jen's intensive elements, we saw students switching between modes, which was quite interesting. So I said before that it's not always helpful to think of onliners and on-site students, even though I've done it throughout this talk. That in actual fact, it describes almost like a mode of engagement at a particular moment in time, rather than a strict definition of a student. And in fact, for our online students who are globally dispersed, they can come and take some of their classes in Edinburgh if they want to. We encourage them if they would like to, and the opportunity and the circumstances allow them. And some of the students are planning to do this. They will come and actually be on campus for some of the time. So there is switching between the different modes there. But I think this is a really interesting one because it just reminds us here that fusion or hybrid education, like all education, it's not just contingent on the arrangement of technologies or learning outcomes or learning strategy or course design. Other things happen. In this case, it's global pandemic disrupts the potential plans that you might have. So improvisation was important. But here we saw that flexible or hybrid education was better able to respond to some of those experiences that were out with our control. And the ideas that Jen and Tim and Joe and I have been working on, and this kind of leads up to the conclusion really I want to talk about, is that fusion teaching is never just about the digital. But equally, I would also reject this idea that's very popular of pedagogy always comes first. You decide the learning and then you just get the tech to do whatever you want. I think if we do that, we miss a real opportunity. From my experience, technologies allow us to do new and exciting things. So it's about technologies and pedagogy being woven together, but also thinking about, what can we do with asynchronous learning? What are the potentialities of having students in different parts of the world? What can that bring in? So it isn't necessarily pedagogy first, but it's certainly not all about the tech. The second thing is that the choreography, is contingent on other factors that I've talked about. I think it's helpful to talk about a choreography of hybrid education because it lets us think about the unpredictable and contingent nature. This choreography, this performance, this rehearsal, there's improvisation. Things don't always go to plan. And I think with the additional complexity of working across modes and having two different audiences, that's amplified. And I think as well that, and I touched on this before, that our ability to choreograph and then improvise in hybrid contexts is about having what I would describe as a fusion way of thinking or a fusion mindset. And so a fusion mindset, from my point of view, as I touched on earlier, it's about designing courses and activities from a fusion first position rather than doing an online version or taking your existing lectures and making them digital or doing them digitally or thinking about how this class, could this also happen through video conferencing? Well, yes, it could, but could it actually be done a better way? And I think that is fusion first thinking. It's also thinking about looking at the potentialities of the different elements and what they can newly bring to education. As I've talked about a few times, whilst we talk about online and on-site students, that refers to engagement at a particular mode of time rather than a description of a student. And then also it's about thinking about how our language conveys or reveals some of our assumptions. When we talk about being present, eye contact, arrival, these are concepts that exist also for the online members of the class, albeit differently. But I think if we're going to get fusion right, and it's really difficult to get it right, I think sometimes we need to be thinking about, but what does eye contact mean for the online student? What does it mean to arrive in class when you're in a different part of the world, but you want to have equity of experience. So you're not just sitting, waiting for the class to begin. You've got the Zoom or the Teams holding page saying you'll be invited into class when they're ready. And then you, as the online student, you then come in and you see everyone's already chatting. Or arrive in a class or a meeting as I had recently, where you arrived as an online member to be told, we'll be with you in a few minutes, we're just getting coffee. How does that feel othering as the online student? Or you're sitting in the class as an online student and everyone's supposed to use the hand raise function, but people in the class just start speaking amongst themselves. You can't see them, you can't hear them, they don't introduce themselves. If they use the online mode and they went through the Teams or the Zoom system, you'd be able to see who they are. So I think it's about really being vigilant about this and thinking about what do we mean by some of these different concepts. And so I'm going to leave with a few questions. And this relates to the book project that I'm working on with Lucilla Carvalho. But I also think it ties in really nicely with the e-hybrid project and the theme of today's conference. And I'm interested in the idea of convivial spaces, positive learning spaces. And what can we do to build connections across modes? How can we help the online student to feel actively present? Can we help the on-site student to feel present within the space of the online student? What about equitability? Are there things that we can do with Fusion education to enable a broader range of voices to come into the classroom? From the classes I've been teaching in Fusion, there are students who simply couldn't have been present in the physical space. Fusion has enabled them to come into the class, and as it's happened, the online students, the online members of the group, have tended to be older. They have jobs, they're in different parts of the world, they can't travel to be in Edinburgh. But what this has generally meant is that they've had a real wealth of life experience, and what they've brought to the conversation amongst students who are fairly new postgraduates, they've fairly recently finished undergraduate. For those undergraduates or recent undergraduates just starting a postgraduate journey, they're in class with people from around the world who've done the job, who have that life experience. It's been so valuable. And the learning experience for everyone would be much less rich without the Fusion mode, because those Fusion students couldn't give up their jobs. They couldn't abandon their families or bring their families over to Edinburgh for a year. So that's been a real value. So how can we use Fusion to bring greater access to education? But then within that, how do we make the space equally accessible, equitable, so that the online student is equally visible and is equally heard? And the third question about sustainability: does Fusion pedagogy potentially reduce somewhat the need for students to feel they have to be flying to the other side of the world, maybe several times a year, to be in the physical campus? University campuses retain their significance. Not all teaching can happen online, but Fusion perhaps gives us a different way of thinking about this. However, all those resources I talked about before have an ecological impact as well. When I run a team session, by the end, this is a hot brick and my batteries run down. There's an environmental impact of using this as well. So we need to reckon with the environmental impact of all the technologies we're not using, not simply travel. But it's a question for us, I think, when we're thinking about Fusion education. And that really leads me to the end of what I wanted to say. So what I've not tried to do today is to run through a set of best practice guidelines or say, this is how it should be done. I've instead wanted to talk about some of my own research and teaching, some of my own experiences. And I've tried to do that in a way that I hope will inform some of the workshops and the sessions that follow later today. So I think this is a space that's still emerging. People have been talking about hybrid since the early 2000s, yet we're still learning all the time. So I'm really glad to be here, and I hope I will learn from attending your workshops and sessions later today. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you again, David and Owen, for inviting me to join you today.